to educators about westward expansion and the closing of the American West in the 20th century. She talks about how the West has been portrayed as both pastoral and wild, but describes how the federal government switched from doling out land for settlement to preserving it under the umbrella of different federal departments. The Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History hosted this class.
Okay, so here is our exploration of progressive era responses to what it was understood to be the end of the frontier. And if we have time, we'll get to a massive adventure in applied history where I got to go to Harney County, which is where the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was taken over by the Bundy brothers and their court. So I will have a presentation on that if time permits, because that was really probably the most intense experience on the ground, of it being in the place. Community still very divided over that takeover and so on. So I hope I can get to that as well. So first, a guessing game. This is somebody who said a lot of things that I think people have forgotten, including me. I've forgotten some of the things. So here's the question, I guess for the sake of a wider audience, I'll just read it. The public domain has been a force of profound importance in the nationalization and development of the government. And the person who said that is probably not someone you would have expected to have said that, because in fact it's somebody who said a lot of things and then he or she didn't end up getting credit for that. So who said that? Isn't it fun to be told that you're going to be tricked and then come on suckers, come on.
It's like an era, like a century.
It's in your reading.
You did.
I said that. No, I didn't. No, but in fact, it is so much something that I could have said, because in fact, the public lands they're the core of the way the federal government grows. That's one of those bedrock reasons for saying that the West, 19th century West and westward expansion is key to the growth of power of the federal government. So I felt that. No, though he would.
Turner?
Yes. I was gonna say, but I've sat at his desk, but Matt got this. So Frederick Jackson Turner said that, and he has totally benefited from you folks being here, because I reread The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and I don't know what was going on. There's like, 7 oft-quoted passages of the frontier strips the pioneer of his formal dress and takes him off the railroad and puts him in a canoe. There's a few things like that everybody reads and they all remember. But this time I just thought, well, I might as well read every word. There's a lot of stuff about Indians in there. Who knew? Apparently anyone who reads it would know that, but frequent references to not necessarily to the significance of Indians, but to their presence and to the importance of settlers' responses to them and to the national government, responding to the presence of Indians, the trails, the importance of Indian trails. I mean, I actually thought, whoops. What I think might have triggered the 1986 Patricia Limerick's response is that that essay is so much about the eastern and midwestern United States. It is really focused on the not far west. And I think that might have been what set me off in olden days. An interesting fact about Frederick Jackson Turner was that he taught at Utah State a couple of summer schools. He taught at Utah State in where is it?
Logan.
Yes, indeed, it's in Logan. Yes. And that is a beautiful drive. I must say, that's a lovely drive to get to Logan, which is neither here nor there. But it is here because Turner loved beautiful open spaces, and I think he enjoyed going there. In his papers at the time of his death was an essay, early draft of an essay called "The Significance of Mountains and Deserts in American History." So something had come there of making him think, I need to pay more attention to the place where I have taught summer school. So this is all to say that I hope I'm giving some kind of demonstration of how peculiar it is to think that you really know something, and then when you actually read the whole thing with care, you think, oops. 30 years or more, or how many years? About 35 years of misrepresenting Frederick Jackson Turner. I owe the family an apology. I think it's sort of, whoops. But it's good. It was actually a very reviving and wondrous thing. So that brings us to the World's Columbian Exposition, 1893. Speaking of small world connections, because there it is, the Great White City, very, very famous episode in American cultural history and political history, I suppose, and intellectual history. Frederick Jackson Turner was there, and he gave his frontier speech there that has more in it than I realized until recently, but it does certainly leave this question hanging. My heaven, what a cliffhanger that thing is, to just, the frontier is over, an era of, well, really world history has closed. The frontier took strangers and transformed them into Americans. It's over. Don't stop there, Mr. Turner, don't stop there, please keep going, please keep going. Well, he didn't, except over his lifetime, he would make various efforts to find equivalents. He pushed education, for instance. He thought education might be the form of in continuing opportunity and continuing recruitment of people from outside into the American world. So he did try to find things, but they were nowhere near as compelling a set of statements, nowhere near that as he was with this. And also, at the Columbian Exposition was Buffalo Bill Cody. They were not on a panel discussion, which is a shame. It's really a shame, because that would have been great, but they didn't actually need to have a panel discussion, because Richard White wrote this great essay in The Frontier in American Culture, where he compares Turner and Cody and really brings them into a conversation in lots of ways. So in essence, he sees both of them as, well, this is my phrase, not his, but co-workers in the overproduction of frontier nostalgia. That Turner and Cody, heaven knows, had their differences. And they were both major practitioners in nostalgia for a West that had gone away. So Cody's shows were pretty much in the same spirit as the frontier is closed. What are we going to do next? Well, we'll go see the Wild West. We'll go see, and remember, you're never supposed to say show. That shows that is how you tell the world that you are sophisticated in Western cultural studies, Western American cultural studies, because if you say Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, that makes it clear you're an outsider. Because Cody never said the word show, and he didn't want people to call it a show. It was the Wild West. It was the Wild West. So, did you know that you could betray your outsider status so easily? Would you all like to say it together? Wild West. That was really very effective. You'll find that gets you someplace in very limited circles. It's not. Don't expect you're going to go out into the world and everybody's going to be, oh man, how sophisticated this person is. That's really great. So frontier nostalgia, and Richard does point out that the West that Cody was seeing as lost and departed was a much wilder and unsettled kind of West, and Turner was feeling sad about the word tame seems to keep coming up here, but the taming of the West, that it started as wilderness, it turned into the site of log cabins, the log cabins turned into big, comfortable farmhouses. That's the Western process that is Turner, and Richard White makes a very fine point about how Turner didn't need to have visual illustrations in his text, because if he said log cabin, everybody had it in their minds at that time. He had some of his key terms, stagecoach or wagon train or log cabin. The log cabin just showed up in people's minds, and it would be silly to say, and here is a log cabin. So as to why that text can be so evocative and so effective without actually any visual illustrations, it's because the reader's own mind in the 1890s and for many years afterwards would supply that. So here are two nostalgiacs, is that the word? And they are representing, they're both successful in their own way, and if Richard's essay is really good about saying, let's not have one be the sophisticated, serious expresser of the meaning of the West. They're both equally effective, and they're both equally creative and thoughtful in how they do that. Has anybody read this essay?
Yeah, I read it a while ago.
It's I did too. I read it really a while ago, more of a while ago, given the difference in our ages. I read it many whiles ago, and I reread it, and it's really good. It really gives you something to do that if the poor students are, oh, Turner, who is that little guy? Oh, there's a woman sitting at his desk. Oh. So if you want to pep that up, pairing him with Cody really does give you that angle. So he does draw some very interesting comparisons between them and sees them as, again, kind of co-workers in this really broad cultural movement of what, oh, this is important. I mean, it's what Elliot was saying several times, deal with it. I don't know why someone couldn't research this. I'm looking at you, Brendan, that somebody could look into that, because
I'm on it.
I mean, it's pretty interesting that they were in Chicago at the Columbian Exchange in some kind of proximity, but that's interesting. But this is really interesting and really important for our understanding of regional conversations and so on. So, okay, good. So anyway, not back to the point. This is a really important point. So this is the term that David Rebell uses, and it is a helpful term and a helpful book of frontier anxiety. Frontier anxiety not being anxiety felt by frontiers people, but people who were not frontiers people who were around in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Americans who were anxious about that hanging question. What will happen to the United States without a frontier? The anxiety of, if this is explained who we are, that's going to be a rough transition. And there may not be anything on the other end of the transition except disunity and trouble and puzzlement and confounded people. So this is a really good book. David Rebell, W-R-O-B-E-L, The End of American Exceptionalism, Frontier Anxiety from the Old West to the New Deal. And among other great aspects of it is that it's very clear about how that sense, and Cody and Turner and many of their contemporaries, that something really important had shifted in American history and something really important had better respond to that many of the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal sorts in the federal leadership had that same sense. And sometimes very explicitly, Henry Wallace apparently, particularly with the end of the frontier, government had better get bigger, because government has to step in and supply the services that the frontier once provided. If you don't have free land, you'd better have some other source of widely available understanding and opportunity. So the upsurge of this, it seems to have been hard on people to deal with, so I think it's okay to call it an affliction of frontier anxiety. And just to translate that a little bit, a growing conviction among some sectors of American society that westward expansion had produced mixed results, and some of those results were very troubling. I don't know how, extremely troubling and really undesirable. So to use one of many examples, I've put the phrase of the time that will influence many of the things that come up the next few minutes for us: timber famine. I mean, really, that's a hard, if you're not a beaver, it's hard to be hungry for timber. So it is a kind of a weird word of associating timber with famine. But in any case, that notion that the United States, which had been the most wondrously forested part of a continent, the astounding forest resources in some parts of North America had been ripped through. Wisconsin, Michigan, especially the upper Midwest, just chopped, cut over, stumps. So that anxiety is to, fear or terror, whatever, that might continue. That with the far west, with the Pacific Northwest, with the Rockies, that the same calamity might happen there, and the extraordinary riches of the continent would be a bunch of stumps. That timber famine, the notion that the United States that had been astoundingly timber rich might end up timber impoverished, that scared people. That scared not just people interested in the profession of forestry, but anybody who saw a picture of the cut-over lands in upper Michigan and upper Wisconsin had a tremor to see that. So those kinds of concerns, what are we going to do with this affliction of frontier anxiety? Are we just going to feel miserable, or is there something we could do? Is there something like an action that we could take? So one weirdness of reading Turner so closely is that I realized that the fellow and I share quite an enthusiasm for phases and eras. And I had not realized until I was rereading this again about what kinfolk, peas in a pod, birds of a feather we are. We like doing that. Turner and I both like saying, here's his Cumberland Gap thing, here's the Indian, the trader, the ranch or grazer, the farmer, and so on, just lighting things up in phases and sequence. And so we have that in common. I like this quite a bit. I like it because it is an experience that we have all had of having to do other drafts. Is there anyone in the room who writes so wondrously that the first draft is just beyond excellent and you would just stop there and everyone says, don't touch a thing, it's so lovely, it's so beautiful, it's perfect? Would you care to identify yourself, or would you rouse such hostility from everyone else that it might be better for you not to share that with us? Well, any halfway normal person has to keep going. Even with limericks, I will tell you that, even with some of those excellent limericks. The Lincoln limericks were 3 or 4 drafts. And I'll say what you probably already know, which is that that's a great habit to have in classes. I have told my students that before I met Jeff Limerick and before I got that surname, I used to sit in classes when I was bored writing limericks. And it's brilliant as a technique because, we'll just cast you, Bill. Pretend that you were writing a limerick. So you're thinking really hard, right? You're thinking but you're sort of going, Turner, Burner. So you're thinking very hard, and you might as well look at me as not. And then at a moment you think, oh, I've got it now. And so you write that down. You look like the most thoughtful note taker in the room because you're, oh, I see that now. So it worked really well for me as a strategy as a student. I have told classes of students that, and some of them have adopted this technique, which is fine because it's better than drowsiness and so on. So, but it does require you to do several drafts. And I will say that one of the great things, sorry, I know this is not quite on our main track here, but I did write some very beautiful limericks about Warren Harding when Professor Lawrence Facey was lecturing on Harding's administration. And one has the most beautiful internal rhyme that appears in any limerick. So you know that his slogan was a return to normalcy, and that he was retreating from all the international engagements of the First World War. So, there was an old man named Warren who hated all things foreign. He liked to live normally, drunken and formally, and spend his time gambling and whoring. Thank you. And it is, I think everyone was skeptical when I said it had the most beautiful internal rhyme. I think you were probably skeptical, but was it the most beautiful internal rhyme? He liked to live normally, drunken and formally. The English teacher among us? So there's a good strategy I've given you for the rest of your lives to use there. So you can certainly use it today if it will help you get ready for the party and the limericks tonight. So, I like this notion of the 3 drafts of the American West, of the Americanized West. So the first draft of the Americanized West, and again, we don't know when it starts and we don't really know when it ends, but that's what we've been talking about, westward expansion. That's the first draft. We haven't talked about the timber logging business, but it's in there with farming and mining and grazing and so on. So the second draft is what we are seeing with this session coming into being, the progressive era. The sort of, that first draft didn't really come out right. Cut over lands, mines that were once full of activity, abandoned, Maybe there's something that we should be thinking about. Bison, almost extinct. So various forms of looking at the outcomes of the first draft Floods in Utah, Salt Lake City, with deforested hillsides and mountainsides and floods. I mean, it's hard to think where you would look if you didn't want to have that moment of thinking, this didn't seem to really come out exactly as I would have liked. So the progressive era is the second draft, and the third draft is still in progress. Whatever its features of the third draft, it certainly has to take into account the rise of environmentalism, continued population growth, to the point where we really do have to say, if it's hard to say where westward expansion started, it might be harder to say where it ended, because World War II and military expansion continuing into the Cold War, that I don't know where you would say, well, period, westward expansion completed, done. Still very significant issues of some of the fastest growing regions of the country in the West in the last 30 years. This is, I guess, tied to environmentalism, but a more conscious and inescapable reckoning with consequences and legacies. There was some of that in the second draft, but it goes much deeper and much wider. And this continued puzzle over legitimacy and authority to define progress. Legitimacy, who's really a deserving Westerner who qualifies as a person who should be making decisions, as people in New Jersey. What are the public lands to them? Do they have any legitimacy? Who gets to say what progress means in these transformed times? So that is one way of saying how crucial the progressive era was for the West, because it's the second draft. It's a big deal. And I believe this is true. If we had more time, or maybe we could do this as a party game tonight. I believe this is true. Wherever you look in the American West today, wherever you direct your gaze, you'll see something that is a legacy of the progressive era. And I thought we might do it as a kind of party game, and you could try to suggest something that I'd have to go, ski slopes. Well, and I can certainly do that one. So this is the remarkable outcome, and with this in the picture, the progressive era just gets astounding in the scale of its importance. Much of the West has become the home of millions of people, and it is now, much of that is now owned as private property, and even more of the West is still in public ownership, which is a pretty amazing thing. That quotation from Turner, certainly Turner didn't see this coming and didn't know that that's what he was saying when he said that the public domain is the key to the nationalization and the growth of government. But I want to go back to this thing that I was saying early on, that what is happening here is that progress from first draft to second draft, from westward expansion to progressive era, progress is changing its course. And in fact, the adjustment, the earthquake of that, the rattling of assumptions and expectations, that rattling continues. So that shift from the westward expansion definition of progress, transferring the public domain into private ownership, going from that definition of progress to the progressive era one, maintaining that land in permanent federal ownership, that is a giant and disorienting change. It is, I think, unmistakably, almost a full reversal in the meaning of progress. It's not a full reversal, because progressive era still has plenty of enthusiasm for finding resources in the West and developing them. So it's not a full reversal. I don't know how far I would go in saying how much short it is of a 180-degree reversal, but it's big. So we cannot be surprised that this shift, even though it was underway 130 years ago, 140 years ago, we cannot be surprised that this shift still leaves some people and communities in the West unsettled and rattled. Here's a technique that has actually been incredibly helpful to me. I just learned about it in February of, I guess it was last year, a year ago, February. This is a person named Randy Olson, who is one gifted communicator. He's a biologist. He was a tenured professor of biology at the University of New Hampshire. He became more and more concerned about the troubles that scientists have in communicating to wider audiences. He left a tenured job at the University of New Hampshire, and he went to film school at the University of Southern California, which scares me every time he tells that story. scary. So, are we all breathing normally again? Because it is scary to think of that. He wrote, this is his second book, and he knows my husband Houston, and he likes my husband Houston, but it's just too funny because Houston the person really likes this book, and to have Houston the husband sitting and reading sort of Houston the book is pretty funny to see that when he's in the living room doing that. Anyway, Houston, We Have a Narrative is Randy Olson's book, and what he offers in it, and I really have found this to be almost too useful, the ABT method of communication. And, but, therefore. Randy is a scientist, and he's looked at different public figures and how they use or do not use the ABT method, and he has really seen a very, I guess you could just say correlation, and it may be more than that, I think it's probably causation, of the effectiveness of presenters, writers as well as speakers who use the ABT method. So here is mine, my adoption of this. And it does lead me to uncharacteristic brevity, and this is why it's too useful, because sometimes if you use the ABT method, I think this is a fairly effective one, then the audience is sort of, well, okay, stop now. We got your point. You can't do that because we're here for a while longer. So anyway, so here we have the ABT of this session. The Progressive Era was a time of disorienting change, and, so then you use your and, reformers responded with vigor and grit to social, political, and economic conditions that troubled them, but, have to get that dynamic, thesis, antithesis, but some features of our heritage from the progressives have proven to be troubling in their own right. Therefore, then, synthesis, bring it back, that we are invited to reckon with the complex heritage from the progressives in positive and productive ways. We can map the escape route from a sense of inevitability and dismay because we are equipped with the necessary skills to accept that invitation of reckoning with progressives. So I will say that a person representing one of the major political parties in 2016 is a person who says and I won't use any gendered pronouns or anything like that, but it's quite striking when you start to think about what happens in political public expression, who's doing and, but, therefore. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the quality of the thought, but how effectively it gets through. So I think academics are particularly prey to the and aspect, or just leaping to the therefore. So anyway, very handy thing. And now, this is the core of our inheritance from the progressives, that we may fight over the public lands, but at least we have public lands to fight over. And it's a wonderful gift to have such an occasion for dispute. Here is there's 2 or 3 big frameworks that I'd like to sort of install in our conversational framework. These are 2 historically derived romances, and I think it's right to use the word romance because they are appealing, they are seductive, they pull people in a process that has as much sentiment and emotion as it has reason and evidence, and they have to learn to live together. They're not doing great at that. The romance of centralized authority and expertise is a legacy of the progressive era, that we will do better, we will avoid less of these unhappy outcomes that we saw in the first draft of Western history. We'll avoid much less of those if we hand decisions and authority over to a centralized federal government place. It will be an agency. There's a good chance it will be part of the Department of the Interior, and there will be experts, and they will think, and they will then offer solutions and resolutions that will guide better behavior. That is a powerful romance, and it is so intense when it comes into play. I think Gifford Pinchot is probably the best example of somebody who really seems to offer that. During the first chief forester, Theodore Roosevelt's great friend, really in many ways the founding first leader of the Forest Service, charismatic, really smart, really thoughtful. So Gifford Pinchot represents that, but many acts of legislation, many executive branch decisions all rest on that notion that someone in the Department of the Interior or Forest Service and agriculture, someone in those two agencies will have a very smart thought, and that will make things work better. So the romance of centralized authority is very strong, and the romance of local control is just about as strong. And that is the legacy of westward expansion, that the locals go to places, they settle, they know the place, they develop the place, they know it intimately, they are the legitimate ones, they got there first, they're the ones who really know what should happen there. So those two romances are both very powerful, and neither's going to go away, and they need to be friends. Not going so good right now, but that will happen with friendships, right? I mean, just to ask, how many people in the room have had a good friendship that turned into a bad situation but then came back as a good friendship? How many have had that? Yay. Yes, that's right. You do have your green and yellow and red cards, and one among us remembered that. So, yeah. And I'm sure that if I asked this other question, how many have had a good friendship that went poorly and then remained poorly? We probably would get plenty on that. But I'm not. I'm not asking that. I'm not asking that. It's just, I think I could take that on blind faith. But you guys were pretty quick on the draw, I'll just say there. But you also were there with you've had friendships that, okay. Yeah, so I'm not going to say, well, this can't ever happen. I think it has happened. I think that in ways that few people would ever know about. It's happening on the ground level all around the West. I will just go with Harney County, nationally famous for armed people taking over public lands, right? For 10, maybe 20 years before that, a group called the High Desert Partnership met. There were federal officials from the Wildlife Refuge, from the Bureau of Land Management, there were ranchers, there were townspeople, there were environmentalists from Portland, Oregon, and they met and they fought, and then they reached a consensus plan for the management of the Wildlife Refuge. Did anybody see that in the newspapers or press coverage or blogs? So I think there is this problem that, why, here's a positive story. Well, no one's going to be interested in that. I mean, let's get some more armed men. And so there's a lot of, that would be a place, High Desert Partnership is where that cohabiting came back together. I have no idea why that wouldn't figure in anybody's national reporting. Or maybe it did and I just missed it, but okay. So these are several people who have an interesting view of both westward expansion. I don't know that they would ever use the phrase the progressive era. I think of what that might mean to them. But they certainly have quite a colorful and interesting and imaginative view of Western history, that there was a time, for instance, we'll take Harney County, where ranchers were very prosperous and very collaborative and very good-natured, and they had complete control of the land, and they used the land wisely. In Harney County, there was astounding tension and anguish in the early period, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. There was a guy named Pete French who was one all-powerful cattleman, just out-of-my-way kind of guy. So it's to have a notion that you will go there and you will speak for the importance of returning the land to the ranchers. Well, I'm not making them come and go. I'm not doing that. That's not what I'm doing. So anyway, it's a very imaginative form of history, and it makes Buffalo Bill Cody look like a real fact and accuracy kind of guy in some ways. So there they are. Here's the progressive legacy. And again, I don't know that they ever got it particularly about, I think ranchers in the area tried to say, we have a complicated history. When I got to speak in Harney County, that was my first question to them. I asked the audience there, does it give you an advantage in dealing with contention to have had such a contentious history 100 years ago? And a good share of them said yes, they thought it did. Well, they know they've had a contentious history. The Bundys were from elsewhere, and they didn't know that. So here's the progressive legacy in a really quite great map that shows you the percentage of the land in individual states that is still under in federal ownership, public ownership. It's a little bit like the water precipitation maps we saw before. Is there anybody who would like me to help you interpret this map as to which region? That's pretty striking. And if you wonder, doesn't it seem like Nevada is often really, really crabby? Well, okay, so that could be part of it. This does not include Indian reservations, but it does include, because Indian reservations are sovereign lands, it wouldn't be included in that. But that's not, so now of course what happened there is, as we can certainly describe the historical process that led to that much of these lands were high elevation, they had limited precipitation, they were rugged and uneven terrain, they were remote, it was difficult to get to them. They were, in some ways, the phrase sometimes used is the leftover lands, the lands nobody wanted. A good share of that land is land that didn't go into private ownership because homesteaders weren't that goofy. I mean, they were full of hope, but they wouldn't have said, I've got an idea. How about the middle of the Nevada desert? There's my hope. There are ranchers there. There are people who take that up, but there are plenty of other areas where, in fact, homesteading might have occurred, and then people gave up. It was too hard. So there's reasons for that, and there's, of course, the Progressive Era reckoning with the first draft of westward expansion, and then saying maybe there's a different way of possessing and directing and owning those lands. Here's the different agencies that create that pattern that you just saw, the percentages. So the smallest one is probably orange, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Refuges. The National Park Service would, I guess, be the second smallest, the olive green ones. And then the yellow is the vast one, the Bureau of Land Management, what is sometimes called the nation's largest landlord, the biggest unit of land management. Forest Service behind Bureau of Land Management, but quite sizable, the lime green, light green, which I have come. The Forest Service people are very charming, many of them, and they refer to their Forest Service uniforms as their pickle suits. So it's very funny. It's a darker green than that. It's actually the green that we have for Park Service here. But they're very, they're pretty interesting. They have a phrase that not all of them use, but some of them use it. I've heard them use it, that when they want to know, when did you really feel like you were a Forest Service person? When did you really think, okay, that's who I am, it's my identity? They will phrase that as, when did you get your green underwear? So, pretty funny. So, I used to say, oh, federal agencies and cultures. I don't think so. I think cultures are something that you have to be people who live in a community for ages, but now I think, okay, cultures. Okay. So, and then we also have in here the gray, the Department of Defense, because military lands are very important. And military lands are sometimes very interesting environmental preserves, because if you bomb them and then stop bombing them for phase, that is a wonderful opportunity for wildfowl, for birds, for animals to take hold. So there's actually been quite a pattern of ornithologists wanting to go study at the Nevada test site, which is not where everyone would want to go, but the birds, that would be one stupid bird that would say, oh, I don't think I'd care to be there because there's been some bad history in this area. So they actually are sometimes, not always, but sometimes kind of functional wildlife refuges. So we're going from this as the outcome of the Progressive Era, just the creation. All of these agencies are not necessarily precisely, the Forest Service certainly is, and the Park Service would land directly in the Progressive Era. Bureau of Land Management, well, we'll get to that in a second, a little bit more complicated chronology. So I'm going to have several heritages that we will go through here of the complicated second draft Progressive Era heritage for the 20th century and the 21st century. So the first of the heritages is the most unmistakable. Yeah.
So when we study history, we know that the way things are now are not the way they always have been or will be. So in the Progressive Era, when the federal government's claiming all this land, right, and we're going through this conservation of this, has there been a time in that, the 100 years since the Progressive Era where the federal government claimed land and then said, oh, maybe we should sell that to like private, or has that? That's
a good question. First of all, I would just rewrite that second draft a little bit, that the federal government in the Progressive Era was not claiming land. It was taking land that was in the public domain, because what happens, just a little bit tedious, but the formation of the United States as a nation requires the first states to cede their lands to the west, and that becomes public domain, and then Louisiana Purchase, that becomes public domain. So it is not the federal government taking land, it's the federal government reclassifying land that was already in their possession. But in terms of your question over the last 100 years, Yes, there have been lots of land swaps. I'm not sure if you'd take that exactly in that category, but if you're trying to consolidate a national park and there's private land holdings that got caught up in the designation of public land as national park land, there will be swaps sometimes where you swap some federal land for that. One of the most interesting stories, and I heard a wonderful talk a couple of months ago about it. Jared Farmer has this article, which I hope comes out soon, on how for defense work, military research and testing and personnel locations, how in the New Deal land got redesignated as military land. And that, we've talked about national monuments and the Antiquities Act. This is a very casual thing where President Roosevelt wants to do that. Franklin Roosevelt wants to designate land for military lands. His Attorney General says, you can't do that. You don't have executive authority. And then people talk to the Attorney General, and then the Attorney General says, oh, you can do that. So it's an amazing story. And so it's interesting that all the, national monuments things that we're getting right now, in fact, the designation of military lands is really interesting. So there's changing status as to whether there's really much of an occasion of saying, here's a big block of land, we'll acquire that. The federal government certainly acquires land to round out borders and so on, but it's never anywhere near the scale of this situation. But great question. So, bureaucrats. Here are two very famous bureaucrats, Lewis and Clark. And they were on a federally funded and mandated expedition. They were bureaucrats. I have a campaign going that's going quite poorly to take the word bureaucrat and just make it a word of neutrality that says someone who works for a state or federal or county government. Or any number of other kinds of agencies and organizations. I'm trying to do that because, I can imagine that at this stage people are going, really, why would you take up such a cause? Well, I'm doing it because what we do as a society, and I've done it myself, is when you find a person who works for an agency or bureau and you admire them, you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and you are treated well and you move quickly and the forms are simple and you think, and the person who's helping you with that, you think, well, probably you just think that's a great person. But if you were going to have to classify them professionally, you would say that's a great public servant. So as soon as you find a bureaucrat that you like, you take them out of the category of bureaucrat and you reclassify them as a public servant, which leaves only drudges and petty tyrants over in bureaucrat. Yes, Lauren.
I think it's the word rat.
I never thought about that.
If you just said bureau worker, doesn't that the same?
The word rat. I have thought about that word for years and I never noticed the rat in there. Okay, so get your cards here. Is that, well, I have my own answer. You can answer however you want. So if you agree with me that I should make use of Lauren's idea there, that I could do something with that in applied history and public communication, then you would put up a green. If you think I will just take a tough conversation and make it worse if I start talking about rats, that's a possibility, sorry Lauren, or yellow, I don't know, it's possible, it might work. So if you think I should just go to town with this insight that has never come to me before, that the word rat is rather conspicuous there, I'd like to see the green for that, and for that, oh please don't take a complicated world and make it more complicated by bringing in rats who are not popular. So red for that, and then okay, the reds are not holding back. The reds. So I'm sorry, Lauren. I'm sorry, but the greens might, I think, have a narrow edge on it. It's Secretary of the Interior James Watt has a habit when people are getting sentimental about prairie dogs. He really, I mean, they're not dogs, and they are rodents. And so Secretary Watt and others who share this point of view always call them prairie rats, which is sort of. Oh, I don't think I'd care very much about a prairie rat, but so it's a very powerful term. Bureau dogs? No, that's not going to work either. So, oh, how interesting. So I'm trying to do something like this of just going, there's two bureaucrats, you've heard of them, just to see if I can repopulate that category. Last year we had a woman who worked for the National Park Service, and sometimes Gilder Lehrman has them, and she was never anything but enraged by my effort to use the word bureaucrat. She felt she wasn't a bureaucrat, worked for the Park Service, and so so I must acknowledge that not everybody is coming on board with this. And though I would say this represents an important and under-recognized aspect of Westward expansion's legacy. Quintard Taylor, my wonderful comrade at the University of Washington, he went through the census for the Western states and territories, 1870, 1880, 1890. He looked at people's professional, occupational categorization. He defined categories pretty broadly, so he had clerks, somebody working for a governmental agency, somebody working in a mercantile operation. So clerks, not just in government or in business, but the package together. Cowboys, he also made very broad in ways that would be disturbing to some. Anybody who worked with livestock. So sheep raisers are in here too. That should not go over well with the cowboys to have that in there. So so he did that year after year after year for those 10-year periods. And look at that. There's only one census just before just a few years before the cattle boom collapsed. So just when the cattle boom was at its peak, when 1880, where there are slightly more cowboys than clerks. And in 1870, there are more clerks than cowboys. And in 1890, look who's coming out ahead here. That's really a striking thing there. So clerks are important in Western history. And I'm not sure I would want to give a prize for this, but would someone name a great Western film where the main character is a clerk?
About the man who shot Liberty Valance.
Well, there's a thought. Yeah,
kind of
right. Yeah, I mean, usually what they're doing is cowering. This is usually the stance of the clerk. You've seen them, but they're not the. Yeah, so this is I could have played a clerk. Here I am. So this is what happened with all of these agencies, and I did leave out one of them. In some way or another, I think it's fine to tie them all to the Progressive Era, though the timing is a little bit complicated for a few of them. But Bureau of Reclamation, created in 1902, first is the Reclamation Service, then evolves into the name Bureau of Reclamation. The dam building federal agency, which we'll speak of a little bit more later. The Forest Service, the Gifford Pinchot, terrain, we'll just call it that the forests the forest reserves were created as of 1891. The president gets the power to create forest reserves. And again, that's interesting. That's a sort of national monument power originally, that you can just do it as the president. Congress doesn't like that and fights back on it. But the Forest Service came into being because there were all of these designated areas that were forest reserves. They fell under the management of the General Land Office, the land distributing agency. That didn't really make sense. Gifford Pinchot yearned to be in a position to get that out of the General Land Office. I will say he had some very strong feelings, as he might. They were evidence-based, that Interior had problems with corruption. I think we've already spoken of that with Indian offices, Indian agents, with the Land Office, that was like a great river of money going by appointed officials, and dipping into that was very tempting. So Gifford Pinchot had reasons to think it would be better to get the forest reserves out of the General Land Office and out of the Department of the Interior and over to the Department of Agriculture with the Forest Service. That's usually offered, I think there's a little bit of substance to it, that was because Gifford Pinchot thought of trees as a crop, so they should be in agriculture. I think that's small compared to the get it out of Interior, get it into another agency where it's not pulled into the history of that kind of troubled department. National Park Service, 1916 is the original enabling act, but there are parks that precede that. Congress has created certain areas, Yellowstone being the most conspicuous, that are national parks before there is a National Park Service, but 1916 is its official creation. Fish and wildlife chronology is too complicated, and I won't take us there because there's different agencies that exist, operate, merge, and the power to designate refuges finally comes into play in very big and obvious ways with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, in fact, designated the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge that became the site of contest. But that's very complicated timing, but it certainly comes into a more forceful era with the Progressive Era. And then the Bureau of Land Management, good luck getting the start date for that thing because it goes back to the General Land Office from the early 1800s, which passes out land, distributes land, and then becomes kind of an ineffective steward of the forest reserves. And people have often noticed that Frederick Jackson Turner tells us that homesteading has pretty much ended. Homesteading continued, so the General Land Office continued. In some ways, more claims, not necessarily successful ones, were made after the end of the frontier than before it. In the 1930s, a kind of late arriving Progressive Era action, the Taylor Grazing Act creates the Grazing Service, which regulates and allocates access to the grazing lands. The Dust Bowl is one good explanation for the lobbying force that led to that. When dust comes from the west and is in the skies over Washington, D.C., people vote for a Taylor Grazing Act at that stage to regulate land use. So the Grazing Service, the General Land Office, merge in 1946, so it doesn't look like a Progressive Era timing, but in fact it goes back to that. Students love this. When you start giving them the history of federal agencies, the students are just, oh my Lord, they're just... Well, there's a video game waiting to happen that would really make that so fun. People with the children would just go, oh man, this is fun. I get to be a bureaucrat today. This is so fun. A bureaucrat. And they do have lives of adventure. The talk I give on the Department of the Interior, I do call it hair-raising tales from the Department of the Interior, because they are hair-raising tales, especially people who are involved in, well, this is not just Interior, it's also Agriculture and Forest Service, but you walk into a area where the locals have used the forest as they wanted to, and you are the federal agent who's going to say, actually, there's not that many grazing here. That is hair raising. That's not for the people who wanted an easy life. And sometimes they work in bureaucracies that look much more like bureaucracies. The land office places and those kinds of places are just work away at your desk. But that's a bureaucrat. So they come in all forms, and some of them are out in the field. Now, after local control and the competing romances of local control and centralized authority and expertise, this is the second big idea of thinking about this big picture that I would like to put forward. This is the notion of thinking of the public lands as a grand experiment in testing the compatibility of conservation and democracy. What I mean by that is that every day in the West is generating new findings in a planetary experiment of great consequence. My starting premise here is that much of what we consider the practices of conservation among Europeans and Euro-Americans started with very concentrated authority, started with colonial governors going to far-off outposts, taking a few naturalists and scientists with them. The naturalists get to know a few of the species. They say, the local people are endangering the well-being of these creatures. Could we keep the local people from cutting wood in this area so that these creatures will not be reduced? And so there's that. There's colonial governors quite early on limiting the activities of the local indigenous people on behalf of conservation goals. And of course in Europe there's kings and aristocracy with their game preserves, with their hunting area, with their parks. And that is a very centralized authority of limitations on what the peasants and locals can do on that land. So conservation comes with some pretty bad political baggage. Colonial governors, they're very popular. I mean, children want to grow up. you know what I'd like to be? In fact, my advisor, Howard Lamar, has a wonderful story about that. He went to a party when he was in graduate school. And his date, it was a costume party. You had to come as what you really wanted to be in life. And so his date wanted to live in France and be French. And so she came as the Eiffel Tower. And she was unhappy because coming as the Eiffel Tower, she had to lie down in the back seat to get to the party. So she was not enjoying herself. And then they had a terrible time because they got there and there were quite a few international students. And my advisor grew up in Alabama and he loves hot weather. Howard Lamar just loves hot weather. So he goes to this party and he is dressed in a pith helmet and he wants to look like somebody from the tropics who lives in the tropics because he loves hot weather. But of course he comes to this party, a lot of international students, and he looks like a white imperialist, like he wants to be a white imperialist. And they're sort of, hi, Eiffel Tower, would rather talk to the Eiffel Tower than talk to the white imperialist. So he had quite a funny story about that. So indeed, he didn't want to be a white imperialist. He was not a white imperialist, but some people have gone to costume parties as them, I guess. So top-down authority and the origins of the practices of European and Euro-American conservation. Who did Gifford Pinchot learn his techniques from? His management key teacher? I thought actually our technician was going to want to answer that because he was he didn't want to answer that, but I thought, oh, there's a hand. Someone knows who Gifford Pinchot's teacher was, and somebody with earphones. That's pretty fun. So maybe he's getting it fed to him in the earphones. Maybe somebody, sorry, I shouldn't do that. I should not call attention to the meta structure that we have here. Sorry. So I think we're going to wait a little bit before we tell you who Gifford Pinchot's mentor is. I think we'll keep that hanging for a little bit. So, okay, so that is the experiment. When the progressive era hits, it takes that experiment and it gives those public lands the incredibly important role of the laboratory where this experiment proceeds, where you get to see if you can get democracy into compatibility with conservation practices. What happens in a representative democracy, Republican democratic government, when you also sometimes need centralized authority, as you had it with the colonial governors and with the aristocrats and the kings. So the important thing to say before we leave those aristocrats, now I'm doing some, I don't know what I'm doing with that. So I will never be able to say either word with clarity from now on, probably. But anyway, one of the most important aspects of this thing that I have brought to your attention about the control exercised by people of power in Europe over their estates, and it draws attention to the importance of gamekeepers who regulate the poachers and so on. And that, you'll have noticed, everyone's getting there right now, that encourages you to read Lady Chatterley's Lover, because the main character there is a gamekeeper. So you may read quite a stimulating book, but you're reading it because it gives you such insights into the history of conservation and its practices. So I'll work on that for some of those other books that we always passed around as children to enjoy. Okay, so, and here's a cartoon of which there were many that make this point. This is, Gifford Pinchot made a lot of people mad and resentful, and this happened to him. Czar Pinchot, he would be portrayed in a way that absolutely echoes what I'm saying, that he has that cultural baggage to carry. And you don't even know yet who his mentor was, but you'll hear more about that soon. There's this guy who actually he really tries to make the bureaucrat an interesting figure. This is Mel Brooks, the territorial governor, and so he really tries to make the bureaucrat an interesting figure. This is Mel Brooks, the territorial governor, and so territorial governor, not so easy to make interesting, but I guess he tried, but I don't know if popular culture helped or hurt us with that. So, okay, so with the first complicated heritage is all of these bureaucrats of consequence hitting the West in many different dimensions. Second one, the complicated heritage number 2, steering by science. So, progressives are all about science. They really feel strong, warm emotion for science, if we could have that paradox of the strong feelings for that. And I will use the word faith there, that science as the bedrock of a positive belief that is hard just to call a thought or a understanding, but something that really does come into faith, that will send scientists out on field explorations and they will graph and chart and note. We're back to really Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Meriwether Lewis as a much broader social program. And there is a hope. There's not a hope, there's a faith, a belief that they'll be very smart and they will be the ones who provide centralized authority with guidance. And then nature, in a way that is maddening, turns out to be extremely complicated. So all of the faith, Gifford Pinchot felt that fire could simply be eliminated from the forest. Study the forests, learn their ways, never have to have fire again. I use this image because it was for me the moment of thinking, this is out of my conceptual range. I've always given it a good shot to understand forestry. I have lots of friends. I'm a member of the Society of American Foresters, Society of American Foresters, that's what I'm a member of. And I hang out with these people and I try to follow that. And when I read Nancy Langston's wonderful book, Forest Dreams, Forest Nightmares, about the management of the forests in Eastern Oregon, watching the Blue Mountains there, that's where I read like 3 paragraphs about how significant soil organisms are for the health of a forest. If you clear cut a forest and then replant the forest, it might not work. There's a good chance it won't work because the sunlight will have scorched and defeated the soil organisms. And these little tiny things just are working away. And when the Forest Service cut in the area Nancy Langston was writing about, they left the soil exposed, and when they replanted, it didn't work. They put some kind of trees in, and what happened here? And it was these itty-bitty, rather unattractive creatures, really. They're not mosquitoes, let's say that for them, but they're not anything that were on my mind before. They just were not there. And then when I read that paragraph in Nancy Langston's book, I thought, this is just getting out of my cognitive zone here. So everything is so complicated, and to expect scientists who are specialists in many cases, naturalists in the 19th century, broader, more and more specialists, the entomologists may not be speaking to the hydrologist. They may not have ever met each other. So the dilemmas of taking on complicated outdoors situations with conventional scientific methods, really hard. And this is our Study of the American West publication, where we tried to help with this dueling experts problem, that wasn't supposed to happen. If you were a progressive deferring to science and the authority of science, the experts weren't supposed to fight each other. They were supposed to think, confer, give you very solid, very trustworthy findings. And our world today is pretty different from that. Because, in fact, scientists can determine quite a few things, but what to do with those findings, that's where citizens and public officials have to choose and decide. As our friend who sometimes joins us in the Rocky Mountain National Park thing, but is gone on vacation instead, can't come tomorrow, but our scientist pal Jeff Mitten always says we can say, scientists can find out how many elk there are in Rocky Mountain National Park, they can find out what they're eating, they can do a lot to learn about the elk, but they cannot say how many elk should there be. That is a values choice, and that's where the scientists have to hand off the baton. So it's important to say, because people do begin to panic at these moments, there are 5 heritages. We're halfway. We're not halfway through the lecture. We're halfway through the last part of the lecture. Okay, that's good. So this is a tough one, because I don't really know how we could. This has vast ramifications, and they're hard to trace, hard to track, because the progressive era coincides with the nadir of American race relations. Jim Crow segregation installed after Reconstructions ended. Mexican Americans, many no Mexican signs around the Southwest, the lowest population of Indian people, the Supreme Court decisions that have exerted plenary power, complete federal authority over Indian tribes. It's Chinese exclusion, alien land laws that keep Japanese American or Japanese people, Japanese immigrants from, not Japanese Americans born in the United States, but Japanese immigrants, citizens not of the U.S. from owning land. Anyway, you can go through quite a list of things that are not progressive, as we would use the word, that would be hard to count as progress. So that's the era. Theodore Roosevelt is not an impressive person, really. when he did have Booker T. Washington come to the White House. He did make some efforts, but he clearly was a person who thought white women should be having more babies because they would otherwise be out reproduced by the darker people. So it's a tough aspect of this era. And there's some border crossing in these issues of public lands that I don't know if it's heartening or striking, but there are places to put our attention that the African American soldiers in the Army were sometimes sent. Yellowstone was managed and operated by the Army before the National Park Service was created, and so black soldiers were there. Nearly everybody who goes to Yellowstone in its early years, privileged white visitors, hunters, tourists, they often have black servants there. You think, now that's interesting. What did they often refer to the cook and so on. Well, that's an interesting place to be. So there is diversity in the story, but it's certainly not in the decision-making, direction-setting way. The Park Service, a progressive era classic organization, has tried, I think I might have mentioned this already, that this is their project to make sure that the history of slavery gets properly attended to in not just Civil War focused parks, but much more broadly. We imagine doing the same kind of project with tribes, so we hope we can get that going, but that legacy is there. And the Society of American Foresters has the tiniest percentage of ethnic minorities, and I don't know, as of a few years ago it was somewhere in the 4 or 5%. I'm not sure if it might be a little bit better now, but they have a very effective program of going, when they have a convention, the foresters work with the public schools and with teachers to make sure that there are kids of diverse backgrounds. But the legacy of the progressive era's race relations in all of these matters, it's serious and it's very difficult to pin down. But it's there. Complicated heritage number 4, the susceptibility to nostalgia. The progressive era was, we've so covered this will take 2 seconds really, such an era awash in nostalgia for the vanished frontier. Theodore Roosevelt and Frederick Jackson Turner and all of these folks, the Owen Wisters, the Russells and Remingtons and so on, very visible public culture manifestations of it, but it's also there, as David Rebell tells us with the story of frontier anxiety, it's also there in a lot of policymakers, legislators, decision makers. So we look for that, because it is a judgment distorter. There's nothing, I don't want to say we want to really have the slash across it, but it does confuse judgment. It does set goals of a lost past that you dream of recreating, which, well, good luck with that, but it may not have been that great a past anyway. And so if you recreated it, you might be very sad that you, careful what you wish for, as Eliot West sometimes says about those things. And these guys are sufferers from a really severe form of nostalgia, and they are probably beyond treatment. So this is the final point. It's actually not called a heritage, but it is sort of heritage number 5, and it's the last one. A point of reckoning with the word paradox coming into its own, and this is a salute to Michael Kamen, who was a wonderful historian at he would not like that, Cornell University, and just a spectacular person and a wonderful thinker about popular memory, and also a person who served for years on the National Park Service Board in very creative and influential ways. So Michael Kamen, who died a few years ago, he wrote a book called People of Paradox. And I miss him. He's a really wonderful person. And so I sometimes would find myself picking up his book just to be in the company of his book. And it finally came into me. I was reading the preface again, and I just thought, what a spectacular quotation Michael Kamen has given us here. I mean, really, we've had, I think Luciano was referring to a quotation that you wished you, from Eliot, that you, oh, what I wouldn't give. Oh, my Lord, what I wouldn't give. And I put the definitions there just in case anybody needs to be reminded, as if anyone didn't know what scum was, but it's still important to get precision there. It's not something you want on your mind. The scum is not let's try to have more of that. So paradox, 2 things that seem impossible, actually true and possible statement that seems to say two opposite things, but might well be true. So that, for the paradox of progressivism, we'll go through some last items here on these paradoxical progressives who certainly had an unusual level of confidence in themselves, but confidence, I think I got this in my years in the Ivy League and Yale and Harvard, confidence can be the thinnest veneer over something that really looks more like doubt, puzzlement. So, not that Theodore Roosevelt was a guy who did doubt or puzzlement, so I will back off from that. But what were they? The paradox that I want to go with these two guys, Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt, were they utilitarians? Were they nature lovers? Or were they hybrids beyond categorization? And Char Miller's book, you got a few chapters from that. You can see how complicated Pinchot was. That Pinchot is not just how many board feet do we have here. He was really a person who loved being in natural environments, whose children grew up with, whose son grew up with that bearing. His grandchildren have that quality. I had the great privilege of speaking at the Pinchot Institute in Washington. It was a little bit scary. It's a kind of a big solemn group, and I come in and there's two people in the front row and they're wearing name tags. Nothing wrong with that, but theirs were really scary because it said Gifford Pinchot III and Peter Pinchot, and I'm woo. But they're wonderful people. There's no reason to be scared of them, but I was scared of them. So anyway, but they are mixed. They are mixed, and to cast, there was some value, I guess, in the clarity that you thought you would get if you put John Muir over here and you put Gifford Pinchot over there, and you had Mr. Utilitarian and Mr. Preservationist, and you had them separate. I guess people dream of that kind of clarity, but you have to work really hard to maintain it because they'll fight you on it. Those two guys will fight you about what are they doing, loving nature as they do, if they're supposed to be purely utilitarians. On the other side, John Muir's occupational paradox. This is just the tiny writing just says, I'm not totally certain that Muir thought he was a progressive or anybody else thought he did, but he has to be in this lecture because he's making my point about paradox. So there's two key words, progressive and paradox, and he's so doing his part for me with the paradox part that he's in there. Anyway, what a great thing to contemplate. John Muir's occupational paradox. And what a way to escape from the preoccupation with purity that can often immobilize us. What did John Muir do for a living? I mean, he did eventually end up writing and getting some income from that, but before that and during that, what did he do for a living?
Did he work in a sawmill or something?
Well, he did. He has worked. He did do some manual labor kinds of things when he first got to California. We've had a theme where we talk about how smart military officers are to marry wives who write well. Well, marrying spouses can be a very interesting and valuable thing to do if you're going to make your living in ways that may or may not be steady and productive. And so is a stay-at-home dad? No. What an interesting experience for the children that would have been if he had been their dad in that sense. He married into a family in California that had orchards. So he was, in fact, quite a admired horticulturalist. So that is a paradox because these are the trees. If you say John Muir tree, that's the trees you think of. And these are the kinds of trees he spent his work life with, which is great. I mean, that's not, that's kind of disillusioning, you think. Because, I mean, he was remarkable. He'd climb with these trees in windstorms and hang on to them. He wouldn't climb these trees in windstorms because that's no particular accomplishment. But those, that's a different thing. So those are the most tamed and bullied and domesticated of trees, and he worked well with them. So that just seems to me a very helpful thing that John Muir did for us, to remind ourselves of that and then maybe scale down the fixation on purity of untouched, pristine nature. That reading some of his works will get us all stirred up in that direction, but that should be in our picture as well. And then the founder of the National Park Service, Stephen Mather, who was the first director of the National Park Service, a well-connected person, a very effective advocate for the parks, somebody to really conjure with, well, I guess to say to yourself, what would have happened with the National Park Service if Stephen Mather weren't in the picture? he was really effective. It's hard. I mean, I'm not going to say, oh, it would never have happened. I won't say that. But he certainly was a very forceful presence in the creation of the Park Service. How did he get to be such a well-connected, well-set-up person? Borax miner. He was a miner of the material called borax used in cleaning devices. That is not him, you understand. That's just so he made his fortune in borax mining, and that positioned him to go into a very effective form of advocacy for the parks. This is not a very consequential paradox, but I love it because it does irritate foresters very much that Pinchot was an opponent of alcohol. Foresters, people who work for the Forest Service and people who work in private lands forestry, they are not opponents of alcohol. So to remind them that their admired founder, and many foresters, and certainly people in the Forest Service think about Pinchot and admire Pinchot. If you go to a Forest Service big leadership thing, you'll often find a Pinchot impersonator. They're very common. You're laughing now. Okay, and actually one time I was at one of those things, and there's Gifford Pinchot, who is an actor. He's a retired Forest Service guy, and he's sitting on a stump. He's brought a stump, which is a little bit ironic. He's got a cut over stump, but he's sitting on the stump, and I'm sitting at the table next to the current chief forester, Dale Bosworth, and I'm thinking, this is, I mean, psychedelic is the only word you can use at that. Like 5 feet away is Gifford Pinchot, and 11 feet away is the current chief forester. So anyway, so if you tell an audience of Forest Service people that Gifford Pinchot was an advocate for abstinence in alcohol, that it's hard on them. So it's heritages. And also, the Forest Service is understandably often characterized as an extremely masculine shaped institution. He had well-connected parents. They played a big part in founding the Yale Forestry School. He recruited the young men from the Yale Forestry School and other sources, but it's quite a male scene. And then he left the Forest Service in 1910, and he got married. After that, Cornelia, his wife, his first marriage, was a very active force for women's rights. So Chief Forester Pinchot is a totally interesting character. Chief Forester Pinchot, who is no longer Chief Forester, who becomes the governor of Pennsylvania in 2 different terms, who is under the influence of Cornelia Pinchot, he is a very forceful, he frightens conventional holders of male power because he is so that. So he won't stay in a stereotype either. He keeps moving through life, which is a great blessing to us. So that is the great part of the paradox here, is that pay attention to the progressives, and you are invited to surrender simple oppositions and to give up imagined forms of purity. The very last case study I just wanted to quickly bring in there, because I've been talking so much about land and the progressives, the riddle of reclamation. The Bureau of Reclamation, again, a very significant power in reshaping the West. Probably a good percentage of you have read Mark Reisner's Cadillac Desert and seen that power of reclamation there. It was originally created in 1902, but it's part of the U.S. Geological Survey, and it was called the Reclamation Service, which is not anything worth taking up time probably to get those names straight. But anyway, reclamation is the building of dams and the diversion of water from streams in order to reclaim land that would not be useful, to reclaim it for agriculture with that. It's perfectly legitimate to be scratching one's head thinking, why is dam building considered to be in the package with conservation? Why would you, isn't conservation about not disrupting rivers with big pieces of concrete? What's reclamation doing there? Yeah, does Patty want to take us home? No? The gentleman in the back, would you care? No. Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about like the general concept of sustainability in general, that if they're thinking, well, we need to provide for the people who are here, and we don't want them wreaking havoc and doing whatever they want.
there's a
So
good
we'll sort of
point.
have a
Yeah.
controlled way,
Yeah.
similar to maybe not. Well, we're not going to clear cut a forest. We want to still use some of that.
Right.
Sustainable
Right. It
practices.
certainly has that component of utility that progressive area conservation has, and it has just the very literal meaning that you're conserving the water. If you don't build the dam, the water just goes down the river and goes into the sea. That's waste. That is waste. Conservation is the opposite of waste. So build that dam, obstruct the river, hold the water, don't let the water just waste itself. Water is very irresponsible. If you don't keep control of it, it'll just go wasting its resource there. So, yeah.
At that point, did the signs exist where they understood the disruption to like ecological systems of fish and whatever else they?
There's very little evidence that that was on anybody's mind, and it wasn't on John Wesley Powell's mind either. The same with the environmentalists. It's not far away as a recognition. If you know what's coming, you think, oh wait, just a few years or something. But no, they didn't get that. Well, Matt, yeah.
Well, just going off what Patty said, could they not have that recognition when the person downstream suddenly, I don't have any water?
Oh, this is unfortunate given our timing here, because there are forms of claiming water in the West that if you are downstream, you might well have a junior right, or you might really have no right at all. So an upstream dam would be based on claims to water that may overrule your claim. So you could be quite dewatered, and the existing legal structure would make that seem right, whether you would figure it was right or not. So yeah, that's a really, but whether you would care about the aquatic life, you might be prepared. There's a very stupid quotation that Mark Twain never said, but he's always quoted. So when you hear it, you must say, oh no, he never said that. The people at the Twain paper say they can't find it. Whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. So you might be in a very tense relationship with your downstream neighbor. In most of the areas where reclamation dams were going, and they were not areas where settlement was very significant because it was hard to do that. So I think that was probably one of the blessings for getting that going. In your reading packet is an amazing document from Frederick Newell, who is the first head of reclamation. Frederick Newell, oh, that's right, that's not him. I'm thinking, what are you doing there? William Ellsworth Smythe is a really interesting person who was a crusader for irrigation and for federal sponsorship of that, and he is very explicitly a guy saying the frontier is closed and we have to do something. We have to give a new sense of opportunity. So he's in here because his book, Conquest of Arid America, is a really good, if you want to see what that anxiety about the end of the frontier means to a person who is recommending a federal program, he's your guy. And there's some of the early dams in the Reclamation Service, Rio Grande River Dam, Elephant Butte, and the Theodore Roosevelt Dam, 1911, the Salt River in Arizona, one of the major ones. I think this is one that Sam was saying that he can't help but find that beautiful, which means he will have to not live in Boulder, because that's not the, even though we benefit from dams actually in Boulder, but we're not to consider them beautiful. So we'll speak sternly to you about that for a later time. So here's Frederick Newell, and this is where we will be actually coming to a conclusion here. So in your packet is a very cool thing. It's from the 11th, I think it's the 11th annual report of the Office of the Reclamation Service, and it is Frederick Newell doing something I never knew that a federal bureaucrat had done in this era, or really many others. It's called Fallacies Entertained, and it's a list of things that they believed when they started the Reclamation Service, which turned out to be oops moments. And to see a federal bureaucrat just say, here's what we did not expect. We did not expect the problems of water quality that would erode concrete as we were making, just various things where it's sediments and evaporation. Just not all of those things are in his mind, but they really forecast. Well, they're very explicit. Some of them are very explicit on that. So that, to me, is one of the most amazing bureaucratic documents ever of a person in office saying this. Now, what he said anything he said in many different places, the human element. The engineers did not foresee the problems of the human element, which is to say they thought they would be benefiting settlers, giving them a new opportunity. The settlers were supposed to pay for the water and also pay an added sum to pay for the structure that brought them the water. The repayment plan never really came together. Settlers were crabby. They had difficult land. On top of that, they were supposed to pay some. If they were ever to make a profit, they had to give a share of that. So Frederick Newell, archetypal engineer, saying, oh, the human beings, they didn't train us for that. So that's a great document. And then this is a little bit, it's not a sermon really, but it's just my own personal, this is just me as the, maybe even not a fully responsible applied historian here, but with all of the complexity, with the dilemmas of race relations and so on, this is still where I land, that progressive leaders and citizens responded to their troubled times with innovation and spirit. Many of our leaders and citizens today are responding to our troubled times with agitation and shouting, reciprocal delivery systems for blame and accusation. There is a lot we could learn from the progressives by simultaneously celebrating their legacy to us and reckoning thoughtfully with their human complexity. So that is my last thing. And then in your packet is this great guy, Tacoma Man. And if you have read that, this is where Horace Albright, who worked with Stephen Mather in the founding of the National Park Service, they went to Tacoma, where in fact a lot of local people were very enthusiastic about Mount Rainier Park getting created. There's that little thing in your packet. It's quite wonderful. It's a very brief passage. A man says to them, yeah, Katie, do you want to, the fellow says to them, don't you think you might want to pay attention? This is a little bit like the ecosystem thing in the aquatic life. Tacoma Man in 1915 speaks to Stephen Mather and Horace Albright, and he says, why these borders? Why would you put these borders on the park? There's straight lines. Those borders do not reflect what's there on the land. Could you think about making those borders in some relationship to the landforms? So Horace Albright and Stephen Mather say to this man, well, that's an interesting idea. And apparently they asked him to write it up and send it to them so they could think more about it. But they didn't get his name, and they never heard from him. So always in our company is Tacoma Man. And we may or may not know enough to think, don't let him get out of here before we get that idea and we really think about it. But that is, when we're doing the Men of Their Times thing, Tacoma Man was around in 1915, and it took a while. Right now, everyone struggles in that issue with where's the borders of the Yellowstone National Park and the National Forest. And so all of those issues of lines and borderlands, there was Tacoma Man, whoever he was, turning the lights on, which I can sort of celebrate and sort of not. I'll be okay without looking at these lights for a moment. But anyway, there's Tacoma Man turning the lights on this notion of, is there something we're not thinking about? We should think about. So I like to salute Tacoma Man as a progressive who we can't name, but we know he's part of our legacy from the progressive era. Thank you.